Hi, guys, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, we have a very interesting podcast, one that I haven't touched on much previously. So, I said it'd be excellent to get David Nolan on. Now, David Nolan is also, you may know him through Synapse Performance, but he is a PhD researcher and he's looking into the sex differences between male and female. Now, I'll get him to explain it a small bit more. David, thanks a million for jumping on. Do you want to talk a small bit about what you're doing?
Yeah, pleasure to be on, Robbie. Thanks very much for the invite, and I appreciate it because I know the hard work that goes on in the background of getting these out to people. So my current role, as I said, I'm a lecturer by as my career at the moment. I lecture down at Technological University of Shannon and also a bit with Portobello Institute. But my PhD through DCU examines sex differences in adaptation to exercise, and I do that through the lens of female rugby specifically. But essentially, what questions my research tries to answer: do males and females respond differently to exercise, specifically in kind of resistance training adaptation? So when we lift weights or engage in resistance training, do we respond differently between males and females? And if so, what are maybe some of the unique requirements that female athletes and female exercisers might need to best achieve their goals and the adaptations they have? So that's the fundamental question I'm trying to understand: is what are the physiological differences between males and females when it comes to exercise? And does that then, if does that result in a different need when it comes to training demands?
Okay, good. And I suppose to start off, what led you down this path? Was it from working with teams that you started to notice things? Was it kind of just something that sparked your interest? How did you go down this road?
Yeah, so I suppose my PhD journey has been atypical in a way. So when I left my undergraduate in Limerick, I would have went in. I always knew I wanted to do a PhD, but I would have went to a research position in UCD at the time. It was only supposed to be very short term while I was lining up the PhD, but as is the world of research, what was supposed to be a 3 month stint ended up being a 15-month stint in the nutrition department in UCD, where my research area was completely different. I was looking at the effect of protein hydrolysates on satiety and hunger, and looking more so in the dairy space. But again, I've always been someone that I enjoy the research process arguably more than any one particular area. And that's why I'm involved in several different areas of research. But then I moved to DCU under Dr. Brendan Egan, where I examined again. We were doing some nutrition-based research looking at the effect of a marine protein on adaptations and muscular response in older adults. And then the opportunity to pursue a PhD came up. And initially, my PhD actually looked at the weight cutting process in strength sports and powerlifting. But as with everything, funding kind of dried up and I needed to pivot. And at the time, I was involved in S&C with rugby and with a lot of female rugby athletes. So the opportunity came up then through different funding or avenues to pursue a PhD where the focus would be around female rugby athletes and how can we better understand them. So within that, I've kind of, although the research looks at female rugby athletes specifically, the overarching principle is this sex differences and unique female demands. So it was that I was involved in it, but again, I just enjoyed the research process and more so than any one particular topic, I would say.
Okay, and what is I suppose, because myself now, be more from the injury side of things, but what's the research like on that at the minute with sex differences? Is there a lot out on it at the minute, especially in relation to the physiological adaptations to training, or is it kind of a new area that you're kind of looking to expand on?
So it's interesting because we hear this kind of banal statement all the time that, oh, there's no research on females, there's none, and there, of course, there's some truth to it. And females throughout the history of scientific research have arguably, and especially in biomedical sphere, have been severely underrepresented and underappreciated. So in sports sciences, we have estimates of maybe 1/3 of all sports science participants have been female. Now, that's not an insignificant number in itself. That's a large number of females. So there is some decent data that we can pull from there. When we go into the strength and hypertrophy realm, so kind of where I'm interested in, the numbers are much lower. A lot of those participants in sports science that have been female have been in the endurance-based sports. When we go into strength and power, it's a bit lower. And a lot of the studies then that have been done in just females or even that had a female focus have been largely poorly done. because of methodological considerations, because it's the reasons that, well, it's multifaceted why females have been neglected from sports science research historically. The classic or cliche answer is the menstrual cycle is obviously a compounding variable, or confounding variable, I should say, and it's been easier just to leave that out and just study on males because physiologically they're viewed as maybe a little less complex. But then also, if we go into the societal norms, a lot of sports science subjects have been drawn from the university population. Historically, we've had higher proportions of males in the university setup, and specifically in the sports science realm, it's been predominantly male historically up until the last couple of decades. So that these factors have led to females being underrepresented within that sphere. But when it comes to sex difference research, it's not that we don't know anything. There is quite a lot of data there around sex differences in physiological systems, something that we call sexual dimorphism. So that's just a fancy term for in a species. A sexual dimorphism means that there is differences between male and females within that particular species. So just a fancy term for sex differences. But we do have quite a bit of data around sexual dimorphism that occur within humans and within exercise science then as well. Now, I would say in the exercise realm, we're very much in the relative infancy of understanding, really in-depth the sexual dimorphism when it comes to adaptation to exercise, and how then maybe that might lead to differing training methodologies being required for males and females, especially at the elite level. Not so much, I think, at the beginner to intermediate level. I think training should be rather similar between the sexes until then. But at the elite level, there might be some minor nuances that would allow us to better serve our female athletes.
Okay, and then with that then, so how is your PhD broken down? What way are you looking at it? What's the approach to it at the moment? Is it a couple of papers on different aspects or areas of it?
Yeah, so my particular PhD is, I won't get into the PhD process as much, but there's different ways you can complete a PhD. Mine's by publication. That means I have to produce research papers and publish as I go throughout the process. So again, my journey's been atypical because I won't talk too much, people are sick of hearing it, but COVID came in, so I had to pivot. At the start, I came into my PhD, I would say, with naive arrogance, where I came in and I was saying the reason that people haven't done these good quality studies on female athletes is because they're lazy and they weren't willing to put in the work. Then I got into designing it, and the further you're going down the rabbit hole, I wish I just studied males. I would have been out the door. It would have been easy. I obviously say that in jest, but it is complex, and it's a headache to try get these studies, high quality studies, designed. But I had a few laboratory studies that was going to be done. Then COVID came along. We're not allowed to bring people into the laboratory. So I need to start pivoting, because you ideally want to get out within your 3-4 years. You don't want to be dragging on longer than that. So the way my PhD is laying out at the moment, the first study we published was a survey-based study where we surveyed hundreds of athletes, asking them about their menstrual cycle symptomology and hormonal contraceptive use. So basically, we want to know, in rugby cohorts, how many people are using contraceptives, how many people are have eumenorrhea, sort of just a normal menstrual cycle, and then of those people, what symptoms are associated. So around your menstrual cycle, do you have symptoms? If so, what are they? And that's the things we all know about, such as cramps, tiredness, aches, fatigue. For those who use contraceptives, what type of contraceptive do you use? What symptoms do you get? So it was just to give us an understanding of the landscape there, because when we talk about female athletes, we can oftentimes just go straight to menstrual cycle and say, well, we need to consider the menstrual cycle. But that neglects 50% of athletes, because 50% of our athletic population roughly are on hormonal contraceptives. So we need to think both ways. We can't just pigeonhole ourselves with just the menstrual cycle. But basically, from that study, what we found, as you would expect in agreement with previous literature, about 50% of people are taking hormonal contraceptive in one form or another. And we do see a high prevalence of symptoms associated both with the menstrual cycle and with hormonal contraceptives. So people have a lot of different PMS symptoms or whatever it may be. But what we also see, and this is the message I always try to get home, it's highly variable and individual. So we just can't paste everyone with the same brush. the responses to both contraceptives and the menstrual cycle are highly individual. So no female is the same as the next. And also from cycle to cycle, it varies a lot within each individual. So no female cycle is the same as the next cycle. So there's a lot of inter and intra-individual differences is what we call it. So that makes it hard to make blanket recommendations. So from there, we were leading into the lab studies, and then COVID came along. So I kind of was sitting back and I was thinking, okay, we've got the athlete perspective of this situation here through the survey. Well, let's see what the coaches are doing. And I'm here as an academic, and I thought I'd go back to first principles. As a sports scientist, my job is to serve coaches and athletes and do that through my research. So I said, I'm a coach myself, but I'm not going to assume I know exactly what the top level coaches know or what their issues are. So I then pivoted into qualitative research. So I interviewed 8 of the top international S&C coaches with international women's rugby team. So these are the head of athletic performance, the top people within those international setups, around questions such as, do you think males and females should train differently? Do you train them differently? If so, why? Their opinions and beliefs around the menstrual cycle, contraceptives. So that was very interesting. We have some of those papers in review. Hopefully it'll be published soon. But it was good to get the coaches' experience and beliefs and kind of what are the challenges they face at the top level and what strategies are they trying to implement or would they like to see done. And within that leads on to asking them questions. Well, where should the future research direction go? What are the problems you face? And then leading on from that, I said, okay, we have now the coach's perspective, the athlete's perspective. Well, then it makes sense to, well, what do we know already? So we do what we call a systematic review and meta-analysis. And that has been the bane of my existence for a year at the moment, and for my colleagues, because it's a collaborative project on the meta-analysis. So basically what that is, we have one study, say, that compares males and females, but there might be 10 males, 10 females. How much can we really draw from that? A meta-analysis is where we systematically look through all the research that has been done. We take all papers that are relevant and we go paper by paper, we extract the data, we put it all together into essentially, if you had 10 studies with 10 people in each study, well, we combine it. So now it's like one study with 100 people. So that's a simplistic overview. But that has been a painstaking process. But hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll have published a meta-analysis that contains almost 70 studies that directly compare males and females, well over 1,000 effects within the study. So it'll be one of the largest studies done within sports sciences, I would say, in terms of meta-analyses. It's very rare to get a meta-analysis with 60 plus papers in it. So hopefully that'll give us a really good view of the landscape of, well, what do we know to date? What does this body of evidence tell us now? And I've all those together. Now we understand the coach, the athlete, the perspective, and the body of evidence. And then we're leading into, hopefully now in September, starting our high quality study where we're looking at, well, does menstrual cycle phase or hormonal contraceptives affect performance week to week? So we're going to, one of the challenges that might face you if you're coaching at a high level is you do fitness tests. Well, if I do fitness tests and every female's in a different stage of the cycle or some are on hormonal contraceptives, if I retest in a month's time and they're in a different phase, or in 6 weeks' time they're in a different phase, and the results are different, are they different because the training has worked, they've got better, or is it because they're simply better in one phase of the cycle compared to the other? So these are the questions we're trying to answer, and hopefully and this has been tried to answer before, but the quality of the studies have been low. So we're trying to answer this question, these fundamental questions, with a high quality study. And also what I'm interested in, a lot of studies have attempted to give a group average. So on average in the follicular phase, what are people like? I'm more interested in inter-individual difference. So I'm interested in, well, what percentage of females does this affect? Does the menstrual cycle have an effect in? And why does it have an effect in certain females but not others? Can we understand these individual differences between females that helps explain? So that's pretty much the course of the PhD. And also within that course, since it was involved in female rugby, I've had the opportunity to analyze the games demand. So we've the GPS demand data from the last 3 Women's Six Nations tournaments. So analyzing that to see, well, is the female game much different to the male game? What are the running demands? Because again, these fundamentally, if you're a coach and you take on a rugby team, and the first thing you want to know, well, what's the demands of the sport? What's the demands of the game? If I look to the male game, there are countless papers that I can access that tells me exactly how much a scrum half runs, exactly how much a front row runs, how many sprints, is it college level, club level, international. All that data is there. That's not there in the female game. So before we even jump to these complex questions around, advanced endocrinology of the menstrual cycle, contraceptives, there's some first principle fundamental questions that have not been answered within the female domain. And rugby is a prime example of that. There's little data around, well, how much does the average rugby player run in an international women's match? So these are the type of questions I'm answering then as well.
Yeah, geez. Well, I have to say I don't envy you anyway if you're going after a meta-analysis, but it's definitely essential work. I think that where you're looking at it in the breakdown of it, I can see the overview is going to be. I'd love to actually get a look at that after, because the overview is going to be unbelievable. There's a lot of different ways I could go down this now, but I suppose the first thing is to kind of finish off on what you said there. When you looked at the results, is there a difference in demands of the sport? Like let's say with female rugby at the minute, have you noticed anything? Have you got a chance to analyze those? Or what are you seeing from that so far?
I won't talk too much to it because again, it's just general rule when we have unpublished data that hasn't gone through peer review. We don't tend to talk too much, but I can talk about some of the other data that we have there. For example, Luke Woodhouse, former English rugby S&C, was with with Wasps now. He did a 5-year. He was over the England women team for 5 years, from 2015 to 2019. I think they did a 5-year analysis, and it does show differences to the male game. So in women's rugby, you tend to see lower overall running demand, so to cover a bit less distance, a bit less high-speed meters, and that's to be expected. Some of the big differences you see actually tend to be in collision rate. So that there is more collisions sometimes we see in female rugby. Now, GPS data as a whole, when we just look at the metric GPS, it doesn't give us the context of the game. Like, the tactics, the opposition, the weather, all these things will impact the running demands and what we see in the GPS data. So we always have to take it with a pinch of salt and look at it in the context. But it would make sense that potentially there's more collisions within women's rugby, because when we look at the style of play, and we have performance analysis data to show this, if you take male rugby, what we tend to see is it's very much a kicking game. And a lot of times you're kicking for touch, you're kicking for territory. So this volleying of the ball back and forth. In the female games, they don't have the same kicking range. There are some fantastic kickers coming up, but historically, there's been not the same level of distance being achieved by fly halves. So women's rugby tends to be much more open, attack-driven, possession-driven attacking focus. So they play open, they play wide, but it's all running rather than kicking. Now, the game is transitioning. We're actually starting to see more kicking coming into it as these fly halves come up through the system and there's better kickers coming through. And that changes the paradigm of the game, because you think of it, when it is possession-driven, that you're holding on to the ball, you're running, it's more tackling dominant. Well, you're not getting up to the same high speed. So the high speed running demands aren't the same. So the demands on the hamstrings, stuff like that, isn't the same. It's all acceleration, deceleration demands. Where if you now have the game evolving, that kickers are coming through and you're kicking, what's the consequence of kicking the ball? All the players have to run after it. They're running after it at longer distances. So then you see the demands of the game slowly change, because we're getting more distance, more high-speed running distance. So then you're going to see likely an increase in hamstring demands, hip demands, whatever it may be. So these are the factors you have to look at when you analyze this type of data, that, yes, we don't just take the GPS in isolation. We look at it in the tactics, and the evolving nature of gameplay influences the physical demands of the game. That one little nuance of, well, all of a sudden a team adopts a kicking strategy rather than a possession strategy. That will alter the complete running demands of the game then for the whole team.
Yeah, that's actually I hadn't thought of it from that situation or from that perspective. With it, then I suppose your as you were saying, the tactics, the strategy is different in a way. How does that change the way you train a team? Then is it more? Would you focus more on the anaerobic side of it with a female rugby, or even as you were saying there, focusing on hamstring injuries or preventing hamstring injuries and that? How do you change the programming in relation to that type of I guess those tactics?
And again, it's complex because there's no simple answer to it. And, you have to look at the team you're working with, because any of these GPS studies tend to be on one team, and that's a limitation of it. We're only looking at one team in isolation. It's no different. So when we look at these things, it's no different between male and female. You would do the exact same process. You'd understand the game demands required for the team you're working with, the level they need to be at, and you reverse engineer from there. Because even if you go northern versus southern hemisphere, there's different styles of play. So it's a different tactic, different demands. Some of the best research maybe arguably is around these worst case scenarios. So if you start to look at, well, at the most intense parts of the game against the best opposition, what are the most demanding? So you have this idea of high-speed running density even was put forward by Shane Malone and Peter Tierney a few years ago. So we might know that, okay, someone needs to cover on average 200 meters of high-speed running in a game. But how dense is that? How many times are doing that? So if they're covering 200 meters high speed in a total game, well, are they doing that in 10 bouts or 20 bouts? Because then that very quickly changes from 200 meters of high speed running in a go versus 10 meters. And it's understanding these metrics helps you design the training program around that. Now, I'm very much an advocate of most of the conditioning should be done in small-sided games or game-based scenarios. And then and again, people argue whether, should you do just isolated fitness work or small-sided games? You should do both. It's not either or in any of these situations. So achieve what we can achieve from small-sided games, because again, they're practicing the skill and tactical component in there. That's paramount. And we can change the demands of a small-sided game depending on how we engineer the constraints. So I work a lot with GA. Say, for example, if I want to focus on change of direction, acceleration, deceleration, well, I'm going to make the small-sided game area smaller so they don't have much, so they're constantly under pressure from someone else. If I want to increase total running distance and high-speed running, well, then we reduce the numbers down, lots of space, so that they're chasing after ball, they're running into space. So you can change these constraints. And then whatever you are not achieving through these games, that's what you pick out, right? Where when I look at the data, we're not reaching 95% of our max velocity on average in these games. We're going to then do this isolated drill that's tempo runs or whatever sprints that we reach that maximal velocity. So again, it's not that, the female game is different, we need to train the program. It's every team is different, every league is different. We need to work with the athletes we have in front of us. And also, you can't make the mistake of saying, well, this is what the internationals do, therefore I'm going to train my club team at that level. You have to work with the level of athletes you have. Because if you try to say, oh God, the top, I don't know, international female back row is covering 200 meters of high-speed running a game, and then you start hammering your club level players with that level of high-speed running in training, too quickly, you're just going to end up with strains, niggles, injuries, that kind of stuff. So you have to meet the players where they're at and understand the specific needs and limiting factor of those players.
Yeah, it's good. It's great, actually, explanation of it. I suppose looking at on from that, then I kind of going back to what you talked about a small bit before about the response to contraceptives and the menstrual cycle and how that can affect, as you mentioned, maybe 1 month. When they do fitness tests, that they get one score and the next it's a different one. How does that affect it? I suppose if we look at them differently, look at contraceptives or menstrual cycle first, I suppose, and then maybe how contraceptives can affect that as well.
So it's an interesting one. So very briefly, when we talk about the menstrual cycle, obviously what we're talking about is in females who are not on hormonal contraceptives and who don't have menstrual dysfunction. So if they're following what we call eumenorrheic or a standard menstrual cycle, we have this fluctuation of sex hormones on a near monthly basis. So people say on average every 28 days. No female is average, it varies. So what we would class as a normal menstrual cycle is anywhere really from 21 to 35 days. And that varies then between individuals, and also month to month can vary within a female as well. So the two main sex hormones that people talk about is estrogen and progesterone, and we have this fluctuation of these hormones across month. Now, they're the high-level hormones. There's a lot of other hormones going on there. You have SSH, LH, and then all the precursors. Like estrogen is derived from testosterone through different intermediate precursors. But all these, and testosterone cycles as well in a female across the month. So there's a lot going on there. But generally what you see is at the start of a menstrual cycle, which is menses, the menstruation period of bleeding, the first few days, that's the start of the menstrual cycle. Hormones are low. Then you see estrogen gradually start to climb up, peaks at ovulation around, say, day 14, starts to drop back down then as progesterone starts to creep up. And then you have a secondary spike of estrogen then as well at mid-luteal phase then as well. And then they start to creep back down as menstruation comes along. But there's this idea that estrogen is an anabolic hormone and that progesterone is an anti-estrogenic hormone, so catabolic, you could say, has anti-estrogenic effects. But when estrogen is high, there's an idea around ovulation that you're stronger, you recover better, you feel better, you have more energy. And then as you go into the luteal phase and towards menstruation, PMS symptoms maybe kick in, that you have lower energy, you don't recover well, you're less strength. So that's a textbook overview of what it should do. But that's based on kind of a textbook hormonal profile and understanding of the hormones. Females and humans are not textbooks, they're not lab rats, they don't work the way we wished it did. Because if that was the case, it would be brilliant and it would all be easy. We see this dichotomy in the science. So when we do subjective research, so when we actually talk to females and to athletes and ask them, does the menstrual cycle affect you? Do you think it impacts performance? We see a high proportion say, yeah, I get these symptoms at different stages of the menstrual cycle, and it definitely impacts my ability to exercise. So they say yes, and their gut feeling is yes. When we bring people into the lab and we test them in different phases of the menstrual cycle, doesn't seem to be a difference. Luteal versus follicular ovulation doesn't seem to be a difference in how they perform. So that leads us to a few questions. So they're telling us it makes a difference. Test them in the lab doesn't make a difference. Well, one of the reasons the lab research has been poor. There's a lot of methodological issues with the quality of those studies. We need better studies. But probably what is more important is when we bring a group of people into the lab, we're trying to see a group average. We're trying to see a mean of the group of people we have there. I don't think, certainly not, I would be skeptical that we will ever get to a stage where we can say, okay, on average, in the follicular phase, you should train this way. In the luteal phase, you train this way. There's only a certain proportion of people that it affects. And what's funny is you see some people say, well, I train better in the luteal than follicular. Some people are vice versa, the other way around. Some people are great at ovulation, some people aren't. So we have to appreciate individual difference. So the best thing we can tell people to do is track your own menstrual cycle and do this for months, 3 to 6 months. Try to identify patterns. There mightn't be any patterns. You might be one of these people that it could be any day of the menstrual cycle and you don't know the difference. It doesn't affect you. So don't fall into this self-fulfilling prophecy of, oh, well, I'm definitely going to be weak at this stage. You might be someone that it doesn't affect, but try to identify patterns within yourself. And then if there's a consistent pattern, you see, God, when I'm coming up to my period, I always feel like shit. My sleep goes this way. I'm not good. Well, that's when you can start to put in individual coping strategies. Maybe that's your deload week. Maybe you bring the volume down a little bit in that week. You can make those adjustments. But I don't think we can prospectively say that to someone, to a female, say, well, I know you're going to be like this in the menstrual cycle, or this phase of the menstrual cycle, so we're going to do this prospectively. Or I don't think we can do that, because I find that somewhat insulting that for a long time we hear people advocate for more female-based research, and we hear things like, oh, women are not small men, they have unique demands, and which is true, and we need more research there. But then in the same breath, you have these people turn around and you have a lot of coaches jumping on the bandwagon, championing the women, saying, well, in the follicular phase, you're going to feel like this because you're a woman and that's what women feel. It's like, well, hold on. You say they have unique demands, but now you're labeling them all with the one thing just because of their sex, which doesn't make sense. And the other thing that, again, and I have to be careful the way I always phrase this. So we find that females perceive their menstrual cycle to have an effect, a large portion of them. We bring them to the lab, doesn't seem to be an effect on power, max, strength, all these things. What it probably does impact, we know that, and again, we've all experienced this, our hormonal status can influence our psychology and our perception. So what we can see at different phases of the menstrual cycle, perception of effort can be very different. So if I was to ask you to rate the RPE of something, that can change. So I'm not saying that it's in someone's head, but in a way it is. And it's, again, it mightn't be that at the level of the muscle and neuromuscular system that it incapacitates you. It might be, though, if I ask you to lift 100 kilos today at one phase of the menstrual cycle, you don't perceive it to be as hard as the other phase of the menstrual cycle. You might rate it a RP 6 today, and that's a 9 in the other phase. Your muscles are still able to produce the same amount of force, but you perceive it to be harder. And we shouldn't dismiss that. If you perceive something to be harder, well, then it is harder. Then it's a higher level of stress on the body. If we're subjectively perceiving it to be higher, then it arguably is a higher level of stress there cognitively on the body. So these are some of the nuances that we have to consider when it comes to the menstrual cycle. But I suppose to sum it up, a little bit of work has been done. A lot more work needs to be done. But the best advice we can give to people now, if anyone is telling you to train a certain way or to eat a certain way because, the science says that in your follicular phase, you're this way or this phase, that's bullshit. The best we have from the world leading experts, and I don't include myself in that whatsoever, but I'm lucky enough to collaborate with the world leading experts in this area. And they will all say the best we can do is track individual data longitudinally, try to identify patterns, and then implement individual coping strategies. If needed, it may not be needed. If needed, on an individual basis.
I think that's where a lot of people are missing out. And I think that's across the board. When you look at research, my thesis was actually on N of 1 and how the differences in N of 1 study and sleep and how it affects different people, and how you can't just give a blanket like prescription, or everyone has to do this and it'll improve your sleep. And I think that's a huge part of it. Is the intra-individual differences with kind of, to go back to the female characteristics or changes with the menstrual cycle. First off, I want to ask you, is there any type of training that may affect the menstrual cycle? I know overtraining can, and I know if you've say low body fat percentage, too low, it can affect it. Have you noticed anything with that it may be that it skews it in that 28-day period? Have you come across it?
It's an interesting question. So menstrual dysfunction is not uncommon within sport, and I think that is something we're all aware of. You have obviously relative energy deficiency syndrome, REDS, as you would know, and the female athlete triad. All these things come into play in this area. So when we look at overtraining, and again, I have a very good friend of mine, a researcher and lecturer at Sheffield Hallam, Lee Bell. His PhD all focuses on overtraining. So I've had a lot of conversations with him in this area. And overtraining is generally quite misunderstood. And again, it's pedanticism around the actual terminology, because overtraining syndrome is actually quite rare to have someone who is actually overtrained. Most people, if they just stop training, they'll recover within a couple of weeks. Where overtraining syndrome takes months and years to potentially come back out. But what is interesting, there doesn't seem to be any strong evidence to support that overtraining syndrome exists in resistance sport. So where we're lifting weights, it's very hard to actually overtrain yourself through lifting weights, because, well, injury can put you out before you become overtrained. But just the demands don't seem metabolically are not that high, because the fatigue, there's only so many weights you can lift in a session. and the fatigue kind of kicks in and prevents you from having too much of a metabolic demand. So we tend to see overtraining happen in endurance-based sports. But when it comes to menstrual dysfunction, typically what you're going to be and again, I won't blanket everyone because menstrual dysfunction can happen for a myriad of reasons. It doesn't have to be down to just the training and nutrition, but generally we see it happening when we have these kind of these red flags of high training load, especially in endurance sport where it's a lot of running, low body fat percentage to someone who's very lean, and then low calorie intake, not meeting the demands of the training requirements. So any of those one factors alone could potentially cause menstrual dysfunction. But when you start compounding them top of each other, it is much more likely to cause an effect. So it generally happens in those sports that have high training demands, and especially high aerobic training demands. We tend to see more prevalence. And then in sports, again, you see so endurance running, if you take the low body composition, low energy intake, gymnastics,
boxing,
swimming, these things that require a very slim, low body weight. Rock climbing, actually, and even in males, that's actually something that doesn't get discussed. Interestingly, there's a high proportion or high prevalence of disordered eating in male rock climbers, believe it or not.
Yeah, well, I don't go on that one in a second. Where did that come from? What's leading?
Again, there's this cultural obsession with being as lean and thin as possible. And again, it makes sense if you're trying to pull yourself up the side of a cliff or a rock face. Being relative strength is most important. It's about being as light as possible. So there is quite a disproportionate prevalence in rock climbing.
And do you notice it then with, I just mentioned there, but with boxing, like sport or weight division sports? Is there in females obviously more so than males, obviously males as well, but in females, are you noticing menstrual cycle dysfunction in those type of sports as well? I know powerlifting is a lot of your background, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We don't have much data around. We've some obviously around menstrual dysfunction in powerlifters. Not much around female boxing or combat sports. Again, don't forget that we're confounded by disproportionately high prevalence of hormonal contraceptive use. So that can mask menstrual dysfunction, because if you go through your pill-free days, you'll have a withdrawal bleed. It's not a menstrual bleed, it's a withdrawal bleed occurs. And this is something that's very important, because if we talk about contraceptives, there's several different forms, but probably the most popular form are the second generation monophasic pills. So that's contraceptive pill or contraceptive. And depending on the type you're taking, you're generally taking them for 21 days and then 7 pill-free days. Now, some people will be on pills that have little sugar pills that they still just take a pill every day, but have active and non-active pills then. During your non-active days, you'll get a withdrawal bleed. The experience may be similar to a menstrual bleed, but it is not a menstrual bleed. So you've a lot of people fall into the trap of thinking, oh, well, when I go off the pill for that week, I get a bleed, therefore my menstrual cycle is fine. It could be masking underlying menstrual dysfunction. So do not assume that you have perfect menstrual function just because you get a withdrawal bleed. That's something that is important for people to understand. But in weight class sports, I don't know, would be the answer there. Have I noticed most of the people I would have worked with in this domain are on contraceptives? So maybe that is a potential blind spot or area I need to look into. Generally, when it's weight restricted sports where people have to keep a low body weight, potentially. But when we talk about combat sports, most of them won't keep chronically low body weight. You tend to see it's more on the other side of things where they allowed themselves to blow up a little bit, and then it's a severe weight cut in that week preceding. That tends to be the more dangerous side, that they tend to do more severe weight cuts. But I don't know. It's an interesting question, though.
Yeah, I'd like to look at that more, because I could imagine that if it is like, because boxing is my background, and some of the cuts that you see people do are crazy. So I could imagine that it would have an effect. If it has an effect on the males, that it definitely would have an effect, or possibly have an effect on the females as well. But I suppose to kind of circle back to what you were talking there about contraceptives, and we can talk a small bit about that. Now, I don't want to hold you too long, so I'd like to talk about the contraceptive side of things. And then I wanted to mention or go into a small bit around transgender participation in sport as well. So, is there a difference in, I guess, with taking contraceptives as opposed to not taking it, in the training differences and how you should be training? Does it? I suppose I can leave that up to you. Is there differences in that?
Yeah, we can take this quite concisely. When we talk about hormonal contraceptives, so it's the same caveats that we need with the menstrual cycle, that the quality of research to date hasn't been great, and we need better quality research. But based on what we do know, there might be trivial differences in adaptation to exercise with contraceptives versus normal menstrual cycle or non-hormonal contraceptive use, favoring eumenorrhea or normal menstrual cycle. That's saying that those who are on a normal menstrual cycle may have slightly better performances than those on hormonal contraceptives, and may have slightly better adaptations and responses to training than those on hormonal contraceptives. Now, again, the evidence is not strong, and it's trivial that for most people in a practical perspective doesn't make a difference. When we look at hormonal contraceptive users only, and we look at active pill days versus either pill-free days or non-active pill days, we don't see a difference in performance. So when you're taking contraceptives, it doesn't seem to be phasic. So it doesn't seem to be one difference between one phase of contraceptive use and the other. So the differences are very small, arguably trivial, and for most people won't make a difference. But when we talk about performance, I think we have to understand that we can sometimes get very cold when we talk about this type of stuff and not appreciate that the reason why someone might take a contraceptive is multifactorial. So obviously there's the contraceptive side of stuff. It might be to control their menstrual cycle. It might be to deal with symptoms of the menstrual cycle. It might be for a lot of different reasons, many of which are probably personal. So when we make these recommendations, we have to appreciate that there's personal choice in these. But again, the best we can do with hormonal contraceptives, because some people go on hormonal contraceptives and they don't respond very well to them. They get severe symptoms, severe side effects, and they have to either come off hormonal contraceptives or use a different form and experiment with a few different forms to find something that suits them right. But if you are, say, example, this is where we take it into context. If you tell someone, oh, well, the science says because you're on contraceptives, you mightn't respond as well to training. You might gain 1% less strength, therefore you should come off it. Well, what if that is someone that when they're not on contraceptives has crippling PMS that puts them in bed for a day or two every month and puts them pretty much out of training for a week? Well, we're going to get much better net gains if we put that person on a contraceptive that works well for them, that they don't have many symptoms of, and allows them to train through. So we have to appreciate these different nuances and caveats when it comes to that. So that's the best we can recommend. The same as menstrual cycle. Track your own data, see how you respond, and implement individual coping strategies if needed.
And how do the contraceptives work exactly? Is it increase in estrogen, or do you know?
So it depends on the form of contraceptive, because you have hormonal contraceptive, but you also have non-hormonal contraceptive intrauterine devices, such as the copper coil, that kind of thing that can work. So if I take, say, the oral contraceptive, you can also have different phases, different types of contraceptive there. You could have the combined pill or the progestin-only pill. So I suppose the most popular one is probably these monophasic combined pills, these second generation ones. So they contain synthetic forms that mimic a synthetic form of estrogen and progesterone, basically. I won't go into the technical forms, but they'll have one form or another that is very similar to estrogen and very similar to progesterone. We ingest those, and what they do is they put the estrogen and progesterone to a certain level and keep it elevated at that level. Our natural or females' natural or endogenous production of estrogen and progesterone are then downregulated. They're pretty much severely chronically downregulated, and you get this new high level or chronic high level of estrogen and progesterone across the cycle. And then that affects the binding of the endometrium and stuff like this. That basically prevents contraception from occurring.
Okay, and so I suppose the last question on it, and it's kind of from your perspective, I suppose you probably have to tread lightly, but is there a performance benefit then to taking a contraceptive in that, like, because of the estrogen being higher, and some of the research shows that you can have, let's say, you can be stronger, more powerful when estrogen is higher?
Well, as I said, don't forget that there's also progesterone in there
Oh
that
yeah,
has
yeah,
anti-estrogenic effects. And this is the level of evidence seems to suggest that no, there is no performance benefit to contraceptive use.
yeah. Okay, good that we got that on record anyway. Be sure. But I kind of wanted to make a quick switch then to the transgender side of things. It's definitely something contentious at the moment. It's all over. You can see it in the news. There's so many sides to it, with the fairness side to it, but also fairness on both sides. I guess to look at it first, some of the research that I had read, and you actually had put me onto, was indicating that the International Olympic Committee is allowing transgender athletes to, let's say, for transgender women to compete with women's sports or compete in women's sports, to lower their testosterone levels and allow them to compete in that. Do you want to talk a small bit about that at the minute? Now, I know from looking at the research, and I'm sure that you've seen a lot more of it than me, it's showing that even though you're dropping testosterone levels, there's still a strength benefit there, and there's still
So
adaptations.
it's obviously a highly complex area, and it's also I think we need to appreciate it's a highly emotive area and personal area,
Yeah,
and an area of it's quite raw for a lot of people and stakeholders in this debate. But it's an important one that needs to be discussed, and I think that again, as scientists, we should be able to discuss anything within an open, constructive forum. And a lot of the debate I see and conversation I see are not constructive. They're too highly emotively charged, and people just are not having productive conversations. So when we consider this area, and again, I'm not I wouldn't call myself an expert in this area, but I'm fortunate enough to speak with certain people who would be. I would tell people go look at the research of Tommy Lundberg, go look at the research of Ross Tucker and some of the resources they've put out on this. But what we acknowledge first, in my area, is sex differences and sexual dimorphism. We must acknowledge the data first of all. If we talk about just the data we have, we see clear sexual dimorphism between males and females when we look at biological sex. So before, in the prenatal phase, you have a surge of testosterone in males, and then you also, around puberty, have a surge in testosterone in males, biological males. This causes a widening or a sexual dimorphism to occur, and that we have distinct physiological differences between males and females. So some of those differences are males, on average, have higher levels of lean mass. They have higher proportions of type 2 to type 1 fiber, so to produce more power. They have longer and stronger bones. They have stronger tendons. They have differences in hip width. So they're just to name a few that we see. So essentially what you end up with, to summarize it, is that on average, a biological male who has gone through puberty has higher athletic capacity in terms of strength, power, speed, because they have a higher level of muscle mass. It's a higher level of contractility. And then you can even go deep down the rabbit hole. When we look at some of the respiratory physiology, they have a higher maximal ventilatory threshold. They have higher levels of red blood cells, hematocrit, differences in cardiovascular function. So all these differences manifest in an average of a male advantage in most sports. So estimates range from, there's on average maybe a 10% advantage conferred to males in endurance based sports, but when you go up to, that could be 40-50% advantage or higher when you go up to the strength and power based sports, weightlifting and that kind of stuff. So we see these differences there, and they're clear and present, and that's one of the reasons why obviously sport is split by biological sex in most areas. There are certain sports where there's probably parity between males and females. I think horse racing, we tend to see it there. There is some evidence that ultra endurance running potentially then as well. There mightn't be that much of a difference, that females could actually potentially have a slight advantage in those sports. But because of physiology in most sports, males on average will have an advantage. Now, the question is then, once someone undergoes gender reassignment surgery and tests our testosterone suppression, and we bring down endogenous testosterone, usually below this threshold of 10, this arbitrary threshold of 10 that's been selected. Again, there was no huge rationale behind that. It's relatively arbitrary in a way. It is based on some equivalency to the higher end of female range. When we suppress testosterone levels in males to that level for a prolonged period of time, yes, we see a reduction in muscle mass, a reduction in muscle strength, but it does not appear, and the data to date, and we need a lot more data on this, as with most areas, we still a lot that we need to understand. It does not reduce the strength and muscle mass to baseline levels in terms of to that the male advantage. It doesn't degrade or erode this male advantage. We still see that. And I think a caveat that a lot of people don't discuss, when we look at that data on testosterone suppression, a lot of it comes from those who are undergoing, obviously, gender reassignment surgery, but not in athletic populations. These are general population people who are undergoing gender reassignment surgery. What we don't know, and these aren't people that are likely not spending hours every day then training to grow muscle and build strength. So what would be interesting to understand the data is, well, someone that undergoes this testosterone suppression but keeps up a high level of resistance training, how much is the diminishment then? And that we need to understand. So when we talk about just the data, males on average have an advantage in sport because of undergoing male puberty and the physiological differences we see there. Testosterone suppression may well decrease strength and muscle mass and a few other factors, but it doesn't erode the male advantage, arguably. And we don't know about those that continue to train at a high level. So that brings us then to the crux of the argument. And I think if you Ross Tucker's described it well, and others, Tommy Lundberg, what we have is this situation then where it's a battle between fairness and inclusivity, because we want sport to be fair. We want it to be on a level playing field. If you allow transgender women to compete with cis women, they, on average, will have a advantage. So fairness potentially is sacrificed. If you exclude trans women from sport, well, then you're losing inclusivity. Now, safety is another factor, and especially in combat sports or collision sports, we need to consider safety as well, because people tend to only talk about the body mass, the strength, and the power in collisions, and they say, well, this massive rugby player is able to run into this small rugby player in the male game, and that's okay. But it doesn't consider all these other factors: ligaments, tendons, bones, things that can break, snap in collisions. There's differences there, so we need to consider those. So allowing trans women to compete in cis women's sport leads to fairness being sacrificed. Banning them leads to inclusivity being sacrificed. And that essentially becomes the crux of the argument. And it's up to each individual sport and society as a whole, I suppose, to say, well, what do they value within sport? What is their value? Is it fairness or is it inclusivity? And it doesn't seem that you can have complete fairness and complete inclusivity simultaneously in sport. And that becomes the argument. And there's a lot of suggestions put out there. Do you retain just cis women or cis female sport and have an open category? Do you allow those transgenders that maybe, or do you just ban people who have undergone male puberty? There's these different arguments to go on. Then in the fairness, well, we allow some people that come from really well-resourced countries to compete against those who come from poor countries. That's not fair. And you've all these different nuances and straw man arguments that can go on. But what I think is important, and again, I don't have the answer. I probably haven't thought enough about this. And it's something I do think a lot about, and I don't have the answer. And I envy people that have to try come up with the answer and make these. I don't envy them who make these decisions. But what I think is important as a scientist, we cannot disregard the data. Again, it might be not. Again, if someone says, because I see a lot of people totally dismissing all the data that's there, saying it's transphobic data. That is ridiculous. Data cannot be transphobic. How data is simply data. How data is maybe interpreted, communicated, manipulated, of course that can be done in a transphobic way. But the data itself is simply data. We can assess the quality of that data, the robustness of it, but we can't argue with the data itself. It's there. So when we have a body of evidence showing this sexual dimorphism, showing this advantage, we can't ignore that. Now, if someone came along and said, you know what, I think inclusivity is most important. I know that potentially some transgender women will have an advantage, but I'm okay to accept that within sport because I value inclusivity more. That's a perfectly valid argument. There's nothing wrong with that argument, that opinion. You mightn't agree with that opinion, plenty of people won't, but that's a perfectly valid opinion. It's when someone says, I believe that transgender women should be included in cis women's sport, and all that data you have is simply transphobic, or that data is poor because it doesn't believe in my bias. That now is a problem. That's not a valid argument. So again, it's this debate, and we see this. Look, we saw it with vaccines. We see it with so many different areas. We need to get better at communicating in a constructive way, and our scientific literacy needs to be improved. And we need to be able to have these conversations in an open forum, because again, everyone wants the best for everyone. We want to find a way that we include everyone in sport, that we include transgender people in society, and that they get the same respect and dignity that we all deserve, and the innate human rights aren't violated. But we have to do that in a way that ensures, as best we can, fairness, safety, and inclusivity of the most amount of people in our sporting organizations. And again, as I said, I don't have the answer, and but it's something that I think people should be more open to discussing in a constructive way.
Yeah, I perfectly put. I think that's I think the way you explained that and went through it is I wouldn't even follow up with anything. I think that's a perfect way to end the podcast. I think that there was really showed the scientific method there about you have to look at the data, you have to look at it, and then also showing the side of it that there is a lot of, I suppose, emotions involved, and there's people that are feeling that they're hard done by, and there's other people, like same thing, you could look at it from both sides, people who have always wanted to compete and they just haven't been allowed because of, let's say, their biological sex, and then the other thing of people who have trans women who have who've started to feel that they're actually included in a population that's aligned with them and their identity. And I think that's a huge part of it. I also think a point that you made there that I had never thought of is that the fact that these were untrained individuals. I think that's a huge one. I didn't even think about that. I thought it was just that you just take it for granted that it's going to be the same. I guess it's the same as using anabolics off season, the way you can maintain some of the strength adaptations from it. So, to be honest, David, I won't even go into that any further. I think that you covered everything there. I think that you covered everything that I was going to ask. I actually had all the questions down, and I was just ticking them off as you were saying it, so I wouldn't have to get you to go over it again. But I suppose I want to thank you first for coming on and talking through everything and the research that you're doing. It's definitely an area that's going to get bigger over the next couple of years, and I can see why. There's a lot of things there, still a lot of questions that are unanswered. And things that need to be, I guess, explored a bit more. Where can people find you? I know you said you're a coach. I suppose you can talk a small bit about what you do. Where can people find you, and how can they reach out?
Yeah, so what I do depends on the day of the week you speak to me. So predominantly, I'm a lecturer and researcher now. But I do run my business, Synapse Performance. It would be largely science, like my social medias are largely science communication and putting out information. So at Synapse Performance on Instagram. But then we do have a team of coaches, and we offer online coaching and different programs and stuff. So I have some great coaches on the team that handle most of the coaching now. I've taken, as the PhD and research and everything kicked up, I start taking steps back from hands-on coaching and only have a small number of clients at the moment. So those excellent coaches I have take care of the coaching. So yeah, Synapse Performance will find me on, I think, TikTok and Instagram. If you search Google David Nolan, either strength, science, health, I'll probably pop up. There's David Nolan by itself will bring up a very high level swimmer and a handsome actor. And so I need to start outranking those guys on Google. So if you throw David Nolan strength or health or something, I'll probably pop up if you want to get in contact with me.
Lovely. So I suppose thanks again, David, for jumping on, and thanks everybody for listening. And if anyone needs to reach out to him, definitely do, because you can get in contact with me, but David is the expert at the moment in all this. So that's all from us this week. Thank you everyone for listening in, and we will chat to you all again next week. Have a good one.